Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Restore Our Parks Act, and I want to thank Mr. Bishop for his leadership and partnership on this bill. I was lucky enough to grow up near one of the crown jewels of our national park system, the Olympic National Park, right in my backyard in the Pacific Northwest. I've seen firsthand how our public lands have captivated both visitors and residents alike and served as key economic drivers for our local communities. And I think there's little doubt that our national parks are some of America's greatest natural and cultural treasures. I am proud that my home state boasts not only Olympic National Park, but also Mount Rainier and North Cascades National Parks, true gems of the national park system. Now, unfortunately, these crown jewels are getting a bit rusty, and they require our attention to return them to glory. If you visited one of our parks lately, you'll no doubt have noticed that they're facing a good problem. In 2017, Washington State had a record 8.45 million park visitors, including families and campers and adventurers who came to explore our iconic landscapes. Now, while they were there, these visitors spent more than $500 million. They supported more than 6,600 jobs. They created nearly $700 million in economic impact. And while this is undeniably great news for Washington's growing outdoor economy, the rise in visitation has also strained our park resources like roads and interpretive centers, campsites and trails that visitors rely on to access and truly experience our parks. If we as a country don't start investing in our parks, I believe we risk loving them to death. The National Park Service manages more than 400 sites across the country and is facing a nearly $12 billion backlog in necessary repairs. In Washington State alone, our national parks suffer from nearly $400 million in deferred repairs needed to restore historical structures, fix eroding trails, fix roads, update unsafe electrical and drinking water systems. And this significant maintenance backlog threatens the health and accessibility and safety of our parks, their visitors, and the communities that depend on them. That's why we need to take this opportunity to build on recent successes of investing in our public lands and turn our attention to passing the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act. Passing this legislation, sponsored by my good friend from Utah, will establish a long-term investment in our parks that will create jobs and boost economies throughout Washington State and across this country. An analysis commissioned by the Pew Charitable Trust shows that investing in the maintenance of our national parks could create or support more than 3,800 new jobs in Washington State alone and 100,000 jobs across the country. Now, these days, Congress can hardly agree on what day it is or what color the sky is, but with 300 members of the House of Representatives co-sponsoring this bill and 40 members of the Senate, it is crystal clear that this is an area that we might actually see some progress. My hope is that we can get folks behind this and get this done. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Mr. Kilmer for leading off on this particular issue and all the work that he has happened to be doing on this particular concept. It is important. I'm very happy that this bill has 300 co-sponsors now here in the House. That is the largest bill, the largest number of co-sponsors that have ever supported a bill coming from the Natural Resources Committee. It's also, I think, there are only 10 other bills that have more co-sponsors in the House. It passed our committee on a 36-2 vote and is now awaiting the chance to being heard here on the House floor. There's a companion bill in the Senate, not quite as good as ours, but there's a companion bill in the Senate that already has a third of the Senate as co-sponsors of that. This is an idea whose time has actually come. We talk about the maintenance backlog of our national parks and all of our public lands, including fish and wildlife land, BLM land, and also our national forests. And especially as we now enter August, when there will be the largest participation of Americans going out to visit these parks and public lands, it is important that their experience be a positive one and not be stopped by broken roads, lack of sewers, lack of facilities, lack of any kind of access that they may need. And that is why it is so significant. We have, between around almost about $17 billion of maintenance backlog only in our parks. If you add up the maintenance backlog we have on all other public lands, including our national forests, it is $30 billion that we would need to spend just to get them to standard. Not to do any kind of really human moving it forward, but just to get them to where they are workable and livable and enjoyable. That kind of backlog did not take place overnight. There are a lot of people that are simply looking at saying, well, let's just try and use the same old stuff we've been doing for a long time. We'll appropriate more money. That doesn't work. We have developed a significant problem that needs a significant new solution. And this solution is one that was coming out of actually the administration that has support of over 2/3 of the House, that has support of 1/3 of the Senate. This is one of those things which all of a sudden, this is a cool idea to solve an existing problem that we have ignored for a number of years. The goal of this is to take excess, and that's the key word, excess royalties that are coming from energy production on all federal lands. All kinds of energy production, whether it's traditional or renewable, onshore, offshore, any kind of royalties coming into the federal government from those, if there is an excess, which means we take the commitments we have already to things like GOMESA, LWCF, and after those are funded, then if there is the excess, that excess now goes into a fund to start working at these kinds of problems to solve our problems with public lands. The Restoration Fund, it only receives the amounts after all these other programs have received that. If there is no excess in the royalties, I clearly doubt that will happen, but if there is no excess in the royalties, then there's no money that goes into this program. Some people have said, oh, this is mandatory spending. No, it's not. Mandatory spending, by definition, means you have to spend the money whether it appears or not. You have to find it from somewhere else. This is one of those programs that said, if there is excess, then this program, then this money will go, the first billion of this money will go to fund our national parks, our public lands. If there is no excess, then you don't have to find anywhere else because there will be no money that goes to that. This is not mandatory in any way. It also, some people are saying, well, maybe there should be an offset for this new program. This is really not a new program. The parks and public lands exist. The responsibility to make sure that they are viable and they are paid and they are sustainable, it already exists. This is an existing program. We are not taking anything from any other program for this. We are simply based on what is already our existing responsibility. If you were to try and go through a traditional approach of trying to appropriate more money through our budgeting process, that wouldn't have to have an offset. What we're talking about here is existing programs, existing needs, existing responsibilities. We have spent a whole lot of time buying up land. The federal government has bought, the federal government owns 1/3 of America already. It is easy to buy up more property. It's easy to establish a park because that sounds really cool and you get your name on it and it gives you a legacy. The hard part is then maintaining that land. And for heaven's sakes, if we're going to take the responsibility and build a legacy to actually buy something and